All right, Mathletes, here's multiplying, dividing, adding, and subtracting algebraic fractions. Big thing when we're multiplying fractions, make sure you guys recognize that we got to multiply the top by the top and the bottom by the bottom. Okay, and our simplified forms should not include our multiplication signs. We want to just go ahead and set them adjacent to each other. That implies multiplication. Okay, let's look at our first example here. Okay, so if we're doing 3m times 3m to the 6, we're going to get 3m over 6m, always writing my coefficients first. When I'm here, I'm going to look at my common factors. Well, the numerator, the common factor is going to be 3m, so I factor that out. There's a 1. Factor out 3m from the bottom, and I get a 2. And I notice that 3m divided by 3m is 1, so then I'm left with 1/2 simplified fraction. Okay, on part B here, anytime I have something that's doesn't look quite like a fraction, I can make it a fraction by just dividing it by 1. Okay, so as I multiply it out, I have 3m squared over m. And I think about my greatest factors here, and I'm going to factor out an m up top, and I factor out an m on the bottom, and I see that this simplifies to 1, and I'm just left with 3m over 1, which is equal to 3m. Okay, to our next example. Here, remember with division of fractions, I'm going to use the property that dividing by something is the same thing as multiplying the reciprocal, or flipping our second term in doing multiplication. So I'm going to change this by 4 over n times n squared over 2. So we just change this middle sign to multiply, and we reciprocate these flat fractions. Another way you can think of reciprocating is flipping your fraction. So now we just multiply as we did before. So we get 4n squared over 2n, recognizing my greatest common factor is 2n. I'm left with a 2n here. That's my numerator, and I get 2n times 1. This simplifies to 1, so I'm just left with 2n over 1, which is equal to 2n. Okay, so my next one, if I do 3 over a, change it to multiplication. This was over 1, so as I flip it, it's 1/2, because dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/2. So now I multiply straight across, so I get 3 over 2a. No common factors there, so that is my simplified form. Okay, moving forward. So now we're looking, still doing multiplication, but when we do this, we're going to want to look for common factors. Okay, so as I multiply here, I'm going to factor the numerator, and I'm going to get y times y minus 1 over y minus 2. I'm going to make sure all my factors are there. And since multiplication is implied when it's adjacent, I'm just going to factor out my 3 of the numerator, and I get y minus 2. Factor out the denominator, and I get 4 over y minus 1. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to look for common factors. Well, I notice that I have factors of y minus 2 over y minus 2, and I have y minus 1 over y minus 1, so those will simplify into 1. So then what am I left with on the numerator? 3y over 4, and that is my simplified form. On B, same similar strategy, but we got to remember it's multiplication or division, so we're going to multiply by our reciprocal. So the numerator is 5 times n minus 4, because I want to factor out my 5 over 4. Change it to multiplication. Bottom becomes a top, top becomes a bottom. Common factor is a 2, m minus 4. Okay, now again, I identify common factors, m minus 4, m minus 4. Okay, and then those will simplify to 1, so what am I going to get? 15 over 8, and that is my simplified form. Okay, So now we're going to change gears and we're going to talk about adding and subtracting algebraic fractions. Remember when we were adding fractions without algebra that we were looking for a lowest common denominator. So if we had a fraction like 3/2 plus 5/3, our common denominator would be 6 because we just did 2 times 3. Okay, but sometimes there's common factors, so like 6 and 3, if we multiply them together, it's 54. But we also notice that the lowest common denominator is going to be 18 because that's the factor that goes into 6 and 9. Okay, so applying these same strategies to algebraic notation, the common denominator here of a and b is just going to be a times b. So the common denominator between x and 5x, well, this term already has an x and this has an x, so I just have to multiply this one by 5. So the common denominator is 5x. Okay, similar strategy here with 6 and 9. We can break this into 2 times 3 times x and 3 times 3 times y. Well, they both have a 3, so that's already common. So what we have to do is multiply this one by 3, multiply this one by 2, and x, and this one by y, and then that creates our common denominator. So 3 times 3 times 2 is 18, xy, and that would be our common denominator. So let's see this in action. Okay, so if I have these two things, I'm going to multiply x over 4 plus 3x over 4. Oh, I'm sorry, over 2. So then to get the common denominator here is going to be 4, okay, because 2 is a factor there. So I only have to worry about multiplying this one. What I'm going to do is multiply by a form of 1, 2 over 2, because I know that 2 times 2 will get me my 4. So as I multiply this out, I get 2x over 4. Don't want to simplify it because the whole reason I did that was so I get a common denominator. Now that I've made sure I have my common denominator, I can add them up. 2x plus 3x is going to give me 5x over 4. No common factors, so that's my final answer. Okay, now with subtraction, I want to make sure that here I'm going to multiply, because they're not common here, I'm going to multiply one by the denominator of the other, and the other one by the denominator of the other. So a over 3, I'm going to multiply by 5 over 5, which again, remember, this is just 1. Okay, and then I'm going to subtract 2a over 5 and multiply that one by 3 over 3 coming from there, and again, this is just 1. So I do my multiplication first. So I get 5a over 15 minus 6a over 15. Now I notice I have a common denominator, and I can do 5a minus 6a, and I'm going to get negative a over 15. No common factors, so that's my final answer. Okay, so going on to our next examples. So a and b are denominators, so there's nothing common, so I'm going to have to multiply this by b over b. And 3 over b, I'm going to have to multiply this one by a over a. Okay, so as I do this, I get 4b over a times b plus 3a over a times b, and I just get 4b plus 3a. They're not like terms, so I can't combine them, over ab, and that is my final answer. Okay, no common factors up top, no common factors on the bottom. Okay, part 2 here. So if I have 5 over x minus 4 over 3, negative 3x, okay, notice they both have an x term, so I only have to adjust by multiplying this by 1, which is 3 over 3. Okay, so as I do my multiplication, I'm not changing the value. 5x is the same thing as 15 over 3x. Okay, but now it's in a form such that I can do my operation. So 15 minus 4, I'm going to get 11 over 3x. No common factors between 11 and 3, so I'm just going to simplify this here. Okay, our last two examples. Okay, so on part A, if I do 1 over x plus 2 over x minus 1. Remember, these are factors. Okay, so I can't just subtract 1 from this one to get a common denominator, because I'd change the value of that. By subtracting a number, I'm going to change the value of something. So I got to use this tool of multiplying by 1. So I just recognize these as two separate things. So if this is x, I'm going to multiply this one by x over x. And if this is x minus 1, I'm going to multiply this by x minus 1 over x minus 1. Okay, so as I do this, x minus 1 times 1 is just x minus 1 here. And I'm going to leave it in its factored form. So this is x times x minus 1. Okay, plus 2x over x times x minus 1. Notice common denominator, so now I can execute. X minus 1 plus 2x is going to give me 3x minus 1 over x times x minus 1. Okay, and that is going to be as simplified as I can get. There's no common factors or things like that, so we're good here. Okay, in part B, okay, again, x minus 1, x plus 1 are going to be different factors. So 2 over x minus 1, I'm going to multiply by that denominator, x plus 1 over x plus 1, as a form of 1. Okay, and then I have minus 3 over x plus 1. I'm going to multiply that by a form of 1, which is x minus 1 times x minus 1. Okay, so multiply up the top. So I am going to distribute the numerator. So I'm going to get 2x plus 2. Okay, but I'm just going to leave this in factored form, x plus 1 times x minus 1. Okay, over here I got to remember that this 3 is attached to the negative 3. So I'm going to make sure as I distribute that negative 3 through, I'm distributing that negative as well. So I'm going to get, so just change it to plus, and I'm going to do negative 3x plus 3, because a negative times a negative is positive. Okay, get that over x plus 1 times x minus 1. So I've identified I have a common denominator, so I can add up the numerator. I'm going to add up the like terms. 2x minus 3x is going to be negative x, and plus 2 plus 3 is going to be plus 5. Okay, over x plus 1, x minus 1. And that is my final answer. That concludes the notes for tonight. Highlight any questions you might have and bring them to our next class.